Testing. Testing. Okay. So, Concept 3 is discuss the results of World War II and show how the conflicts in ideologies, wartime politics, and America's new economic and military position led to the Cold War and the atomic age. So, ideology can be defined as a system of beliefs required to sustain some existing order. The central theme of American ideology since the 18th century has been the theme of liberty, both economical and political. In the 20th century, American businessmen and politicians could not help but become hostile towards economic and political practices in other cultures which impeded the practice of capitalism. One of the most difficult challenges to the American ideology and statesmen after 1917 was Russia. In setting up the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, Marxian revolutionaries under Lenin, established a regime that American leaders considered basically hostile to their own political and economic system or ideology. Similar revolts seem to threaten Spain, Germany, Hungary, China, and Mexico. It seemed to many Americans these revolts could happen in the United States. In Russia, the Bolsheviks repudiated Tsarist debts, claimed state ownership over national resources, and threw out foreign investors. American leaders grew alarmed. Woodrow Wilson saw the Bolsheviks as opposed to everything he stood for: law and order, constitutional democracy, and civil liberties. Consequently, Wilson, as well as Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, refused to recognize the Soviet Union. Finally, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized the Soviet government, hoping to improve American trade during the Depression. In a sense, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union originated in 1917 and was only temporarily suspended between 1941 and 1945. In 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States renewed the mutual hostility that had started in 1917. Each perceived the other as having gone back on promises, imposing a military threat. Russia's need for a buffer zone in Eastern Europe to uphold Soviet communism clashed head-on with American traditional belief in freedom and independence. States should have free access to the world's markets and raw material, and should be allowed to exert dynamic leadership over world trade, right, the basis of capitalism. So many of the problems that plagued the post-world resulted from disagreements in wartime policy. As a result of the conflict in ideologies, both the United States and the Soviet Union entered World War II suspicious of each other. Soviet suspicions of the West began to become very strong in 1942 and again in 1943, when the British and the United States twice delayed in opening up a second front against Germany. Consequently, the Red Army paid a costly price to roll back the Nazi invaders across Russia and Eastern Europe. At the height of the German invasion of Russia, more than 300 Soviet divisions had been locked in battle with 250 ones, a striking contrast to 58 divisions the United States and Britain used in the Normandy invasion on D-Day of 1944. Consequently, the Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses of the war: over 6 million military deaths, over 10 million civilian dead, and at least 25 million left homeless. When the total death figures for all countries are compared, 17 million military, 18 million civilian, it is clear the Soviets paid the greatest price during the war. Thus, as the Soviet armies overran Poland and the Balkan countries, Stalin was determined to retain control over this region, which had been the historic pathway for Western invasion into Russia. So they've had this deep distrust of Western countries that goes back at least 1,000 years. The delay in opening the second front and an innate distrust of the West convinced the Soviets they should maximize their territorial gains by imposing communist regimes on Eastern Europe. Stalin was able to accomplish this at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. So it was in Yalta that the map of the post-war world took shape. Here, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed in principle to the idea of a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, but they left its actual dimensions deliberately vague. In return, Stalin pledged to 1. Hold free elections at unspecified times, agreed to the formation of a permanent United Nations organization, and 3. Enter the Pacific War 3 months after Germany surrendered. The last pledge was the most important to Roosevelt, since the American Joint Chiefs of Staff still estimated Japan could hold out for 18 months after the defeat of Germany. Costly campaigns lay ahead, and the atomic bomb was still an expensive, unknowable gamble at this point. The Yalta agreements were later attacked for giving Eastern Europe over to the Soviet domination. But the course of the war shaped the actions of Yalta, and the Soviets' geographical control of the area put them in a position to get what they wanted. The defeat of Nazi Germany dissolved the one strong bond between the United States and the Soviet Union. With very different histories, culture, and ideologies, the two nations were bound to drift apart. And with the death of Roosevelt, it would be up to the inexperienced Harry Truman to manage the growing rivalry that was destined to develop into the Cold War. Also, the wartime policy followed by Roosevelt and Churchill ensured a post-war nuclear arms race. Instead of forming their major ally of the commitment to developing the atomic bomb in 1940, they kept it closely guarded secret. Stalin learned of the Manhattan Project through espionage and responded by starting a Soviet atomic program in 1943, which he would later have completed in 1949. So the war's end opened a new era for the United States. It accelerated the growth of America's American power while devastating all other world powers, leaving the United States economically and militarily the strongest nation on Earth. The war also brought about the birth of the atomic age, as the United States used the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So the devastating impact of World War II on European economies and the impact of war mobilization in the United States laid the foundation for post-war economic developments. Unlike the Soviet Union, which had lost between 16 and 18 million of its citizens, or Western Europe and Japan, whose landscapes and economies had been completely destroyed through the fighting, the United States emerged physically unscathed from the war. In fact, the American economy was in far better shape in 1945 than when the war began in 1941. During the war, American consumers had accumulated savings of $140 billion, which created a strong market for consumer goods that had been unavailable during the war. Also, the federal government eased conversion into peacetime economy by allowing businessmen to buy factories built for the war effort at a fraction of the cost. In addition, business quickly applied the scientific and technological innovations developed for war production, such as plastics and synthetic fibers, to the production of consumer goods. So the steady growth of the American economy produced a 25% rise in purchasing power between 1946 and 1960. In 1940, 43% of American families owned their homes, but by 1960 the figure had increased to 62%. These figures can be misleading. While the standard of living was rising, there was no redistribution of income. The percentage of income received by each segment of the population was substantially the same as it had been in 1910 and in 1939. Americans were living better because of economic growth and the domination of the United States economy in the world economy, however. The concentration of income remained unchanged. World War II also brought about a revolution in American foreign policy, ending 2 centuries of isolation from world diplomatic affairs. Before the war, the United States had no formal alliances, no troops stationed on foreign soil, and only a small defense budget. After 1945, the United States willingly sought a lasting, indeed dominant role in international affairs. A state of permanent mobilization has characterized American society ever since to this very second. The dramatic shift in American foreign policy after 1945 had important domestic repercussions. One, a permanent mobilization required higher defense expenditures and a military draft. It also fostered the creation of a powerful military establishment that linked armed services with scientific and corporate communities in the cause of national security. Later, Eisenhower would describe this growing relationship as the military-industrial complex, and we'll look more at that in the Cold War lecture. Finally, permanent mobilization led to a revolution in American government, as the executive branch assumed an almost uncheckable authority over the conduct of foreign affairs. American post-war foreign policy also combined both old and new concerns. In keeping with the ideals enunciated by Woodrow Wilson during World War I, the United States continued to promote the peaceful expansion of its capitalist economic system throughout the world. At the same time, the United States continued to support the development of political democracy, national self-determination, and the breakup of colonial empires, rhetorically. In actual reality, though, as we'll see with the Cold War, things didn't. The situation on the ground, because of Cold War politics, did not match American rhetoric of self-determination and the breakup of colonial empires, especially when it comes to Vietnam. By 1947, new policy directions started to rival and finally overshadow the economic considerations. Hence, the most striking aspect of the post-war American foreign policy was the ideological confrontation with the Soviet Union and the accompanying military and diplomatic efforts to contain the spread of communism. And again, we'll look at that a little bit deeper in the next lecture series. So this desire to maintain military parity with the Soviets and the corresponding Soviet push to match American strength set in motion the arms race that dominated the post-war period and political environment that historians called the Cold War. And again, we'll take a look at that closer in the next lecture series. Talk to you guys later.